listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. For days now, we've been hearing about the perks our politicians get from airlines, especially Qantas and its invite-only chairman's lounge. But what actually happens in there? And should we really expect prime ministers to slum it in economy with the rest of us?
Politicians are the only people in Australia who can pay for an economy ticket but never fly economy. Now, we can't do that. Why should they do that when it's their job to keep Qantas in line?
In the second half of this episode, The Briefing's Bension Siebert takes us behind the curtain at the exclusive club. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Antoinette Lattouf. It's Wednesday, the 6th of November.
G'day, Sasha. Hello, everyone. We have been talking about it for months, and the moment is now here because the polls are now open in every state across America for perhaps the most vexed presidential election in history. So Kamala Harris for the Democrats is fighting to make history as the first female president of the United States, while Donald Trump is attempting to become just the second person in the country's history to be re-elected as president after being voted out. So the successful candidate will need 270 electoral college votes to claim victory. And if you don't know what that means and want an explainer on exactly how the system works, we did a deep dive on it on Monday afternoon. It's worth checking out. So Trump has voted in Florida alongside his wife, Melania Trump. And he spoke to reporters after casting his ballot because he was asked about whether he'll tell his supporters to refrain from violence.
I certainly don't want any violence, but I certainly don't have to tell. These are great people. These are people that believe in no violence. Unlike your question, you believe in violence.
Such a strange response, but not uncommon to get something strange from Trump.
Yeah, as Kamala Harris might say, straight out of his typical playbook. And look, speaking of the Democratic nominee, she cast her vote earlier this week. She mailed hers in from Detroit. But she's still campaigning even on election day. Kamala has called into radio stations in swing states, including the Big Tigger morning show in Atlanta. And she encouraged locals to get out and have their say today.
We got to get it done. Today is voting day, and people need to get out and be active. The polls close at 7 p.m. And that's what my focus is right now today, I must admit, which is making sure everybody knows the power of their voice through their vote.
Amen.
So it has been an absolutely crazy couple of months in this election campaign, Antoinette. You kind of alluded to it at the top of the show. We've had Joe Biden and Trump's debate. Then there were the weeks of speculation about the president's health before he finally dropped out. There was the attempted assassination of the Republican nominee, the party conventions, and then Harris taking the nomination for the Democrats. So I guess what happens now? What can we expect to play out over the next few hours? Well, the deciding factor today is going to be the battleground states that swing between the parties. So keep an eye on results in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
And Michigan in particular has the largest Arab and Muslim vote in the United States. And so there's been a lot of speculation about how voters will go there based on the ongoing violence in Palestine and Israel. Will they cast their vote for Kamala Harris, who's been overseeing and in many ways greenlighting this violence? Or will they turn to Donald Trump, where many of his domestic policies aren't great for minorities? And so when will we start to see those results coming through? The first polls don't start to close until 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, and it will be a slow trickle from that point. And if there's a clear winner, we should know the results by dinner time, our time. But if things are too close to call, and we know that's a possibility if the polls are an indication, it could be days until the new president is declared.
Yeah, so it's going to be an absolutely massive day. I, for one, have been wishing people this morning a Merry Christmas, as in a Merry Journo Christmas, because I love an election. I'm a loser. It is worth noting we have seen the first results actually already come through. So there's this tiny town in New Hampshire called Dixville Notch. It has 6 residents, and it's continued its decades-long tradition where they vote right after midnight and they call the vote out publicly, and it's filmed, and it's kind of become this, keen news watcher event every election day. So out of the 6 residents in the town, it was a 3-all tie for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, exactly, which is exactly what we've been seeing in the polls. And look, there's one other tidbit that could have an effect today on voter turnout. We know more than 70 million Americans have already mailed in their votes, but in terms of people going out to vote on the day, there is a big band of really nasty weather. They reckon heavy rain and thunderstorms could impact this huge swathe of the country, and it could bring that severe weather for the next 48 hours. So we know voting isn't compulsory in the US. And think about if we were here and it was voting day and it was really stormy and windy and it's cold, it's November in the US, it's getting into their winter. I mean, I know a lot of people who would turn around and go, I can't be bothered. I think I'm going to just stay in today. So that is a factor, and we've seen weather impact previous votes in the US. So, as I said, it's a huge day, and we're going to have all the wrap up tomorrow as well on the show, so make sure you tune in. This afternoon, we are going to have a deep dive with someone on the ground in the US who's going to take us through everything we've learnt so far. Back home now into other news, the Qantas Chairman's Lounge saga has found its latest victim, WA's Premier Roger Cook. He told journos last week that he was a member of the exclusive lounge and that he declares it every year. However, it did not form part of his annual disclosure to State Parliament. In WA, MPs must disclose any gifts worth more than $500 on their register of members' financial interests.
So this all comes as federal MPs face mounting pressure to give up their memberships to avoid conflicts of interest, with many expressing concern about Labor's decision to block Qatar Airways' request to increase Australian routes last year. And the move's been criticised as being anti-competitive and directly benefiting the national carrier. So disclosures, Sasha, in WA have been tabled in Parliament since 2021, and they're part of reforms driven by the Labor Party in a bid to increase transparency, or where any conflicts of interest are going to be more easily detected. And it is worth noting, and definitely worth listening to today's deep dive, because that looks inside the Chairman's Lounge with Joe Aston, who's a journo, and Independent Senator David Pocock.
Prince William has made a surprise cameo on Robert Irwin's Instagram page.
Well, g'day, it's Robert here with, of course, Prince William. Lovely to see you.
You too, Robert.
The unlikely pair have teamed up to promote the Earthshot Prize in South Africa, climbing Mount Signal together. Will's founded the initiative, which awards sustainable, eco-friendly projects from around the world, with 5 winners each receiving £1 million, which is about 2 million Australian. And Robert Irwin is an ambassador for the project. So this awkward video, Antoinette, between the pair did continue, with the wildlife warrior asking the prince about his favourite African animal.
Oh, it's a tough question.
It's a really tough question, and my children ask me this regularly. I think I'm going to have to say the cheetah.
Jesus, okay.
Cheetahs.
Very cool,
Fantastic.
very cool.
Yeah, that did sound very cool and very good. Not awkward at all. And the Melbourne Cup ran yesterday, Knight's Choice won, and we aired an episode yesterday examining the arguments for and against the Melbourne Cup, because it has become a more, contentious day, and there certainly seems to be a generational difference in how people view the day and if they celebrate it. Also, in our broadcast channel on Instagram, Behind the Briefing, we asked if our listeners would be participating in events for the Cup, and the results are pretty overwhelming. 87% said no, Sasha.
Yeah, I found it interesting yesterday, Antoinette. I'm not particularly fussed on the Melbourne Cup, but I've always noticed in the years, especially working in the industry we work in, there's always chatter about it and there's big news stories. It was really quiet yesterday. I didn't see anything on my socials about it. I definitely feel like, especially with the younger generations coming through, it maybe just isn't the cultural event that it used to be. But I want to say thank you to every one of our listeners who voted and shared their thoughts on the Melbourne Cup. We hope you enjoyed the episode yesterday. But now it is time for our deep dive, and we are taking you behind the curtains at Qantas's exclusive Chairman's Lounge.
Hey, Bension here. It's been all over the news for more than a week now. Some 90% of Australian federal politicians are members of the exclusive, luxurious, invite-only Qantas Chairman's Lounge. And many of them have accepted free upgrades and other perks the rest of us may never enjoy. This has been going on for decades. It's benefited pollies from just about every political persuasion, and as far as we know, these freebies have all been declared. But where do we draw the line between the expected perks of politicians' jobs and favours that risk influencing their decisions? Today, we're bringing you inside the room where it happens. The author and columnist who kicked off this whole scandal last week, Joe Aston, tells us what really goes on inside the Chairman's Lounge. After him, I'll be asking Independent Senator David Pocock why he gave up his membership last year and why he ever accepted it in the first place. Joe Aston, welcome to the briefing.
Thanks for having me.
So, you walk into the Qantas Chairman's Lounge. What do you see and what do you get?
You see splendour. You can almost smell success. It sort of reminds you of that Anchorman thing, you know, where you can smell the rich mahogany and the leather-bound books. There is something deeply luxurious about the Chairman's Lounge as a place. It's hushed, you know, which many luxurious spaces are. Quiet feels like a privilege in this modern day. And, you know, there's beautiful Italian leather furniture, and there's a restaurant, an a la carte restaurant where you can go and order from an extensive menu. Of course, there's no prices on the food because it's all part of the package. Neil Perry's got his steak sandwich and all of the usual trappings. You can have unlimited premium spirits and wines. Of course, only up to the level of responsible service of alcohol, I'm sure. But, yeah, look, that's where Chairman's Lounge members go before their domestic flights, while the rest of us slum it in the threadbare Qantas Club, if we're lucky.
If we're lucky is right. Who are you likely to run into at the Qantas Chairman's Lounge? Do lobbyists hang around and hope to bend the ear of politicians that turn up there?
Lobbyists would love to get into the Chairman's Lounge. Some of them do. Not many of them, though. I mean, you'd have to be doing very well to weasel your way in there. You're more likely to run into federal politicians, public servants, very senior public servants, and also very top business people. So CEOs, members of the boards of large companies, very senior members of like the big four accounting firms and the law firms. Any company that spends millions and millions of dollars travelling with Qantas, part of the deal is for every $1 million that they spend with Qantas, they get one Chairman's Lounge membership. So, you know, if you've got a really big white-collar travelling workforce, like a law firm or a really big, you know, mining company or something like that, you might spend $7, $8, $10 million a year, and so you get 7, 8 or 10 Chairman's Lounge memberships, including potentially for your spouse as well. And that's where the Hunger Games really begin. You know, I'm told many times about the internal fights in these companies when they're deciding who gets those memberships. And it is really a fight to the death.
What does it look like, given that there are so many incredibly highly powerful people who just happen to be together in these rooms? What do those conversations look like? Are there deals that are being made?
Absolutely. I've spoken to consultants who tell me that, you know, up to half of the business that they generate comes from accidental, informal conversations that happen in the Chairman's Lounge. So it has a huge commercial value, and that's why people are desperate to hang on to it. And it's not the only reason people are desperate to hang on to it, by the way. There's also all of the status implications, because also if you think about it, if you're in the Chairman's Lounge and someone comes up and says, look, you really should do this and I can help you do that, you're going to have your guard down. You have a higher level of trust because there's almost like a pre-clearance that's happened. You know, you're in the Chairman's Lounge with me, therefore you're like me, you're of my kind, and therefore I probably trust what you say. I might even buy what you're selling.
I guess this is where it gets a little bit murky and the line gets a bit blurred. Plenty of people might say, for example, the Prime Minister has the most important job in the country. Whatever your politics, you want the Prime Minister to be able to do their job well. Why shouldn't someone like Anthony Albanese or any other politician not get access to this kind of luxury?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And I also think you have to remember that companies like Qantas have a right to be heard. You know, they have a right to go to Canberra and have their position put. But what they should be doing is only going through the front door like everyone else, making an appointment the appropriate way. What the Chairman's Lounge allows them to do is have these powerful people enjoying their hospitality and in that sort of environment where they can potentially be lobbied. But the fact is, I don't think there's any issue with business people going into the Chairman's Lounge. The issue is when public officials are going into the Chairman's Lounge And we're paying them and electing them and trusting them to act the right way on our behalf. And the thing about my book, The Chairman's Lounge, is it's about how public officials failed to make sure that Qantas was acting the right way during COVID and coming out of COVID, when its prices were at record highs, its customer service was at record lows, and the public was in uproar about how people were being treated by the airline. And politicians seem to be the last to notice that that was happening. And you can understand why that's the case, because they don't wait 11 hours on the phone to, track down a lost bag or to try and redeem a COVID credit. So I think the problem with the Chairman's Lounge is it creates this total gap between the experience of politicians who are there to represent us and the experience of the wider public, who are not having a very luxurious experience these days with Qantas.
There's been national coverage of this story for days and days now. Do you think that politicians just outright should be banned from entering or from having memberships with these spaces?
I think it's getting close to that being required. I mean, if we could trust politicians to, act in the best interest and have their ear to the ground to what the public mood is, then I don't think it would be an issue. But they've proven again and again that they can't be. I think more so than the Chairman's Lounge itself, it's upgrades that probably need to be banned. There's just no reason why elected officials should be accepting upgrades worth, multiple thousands of dollars on their personal travel. Like, people finally understand that politicians are the only people in Australia who can pay for an economy ticket but never fly economy. Now, we can't do that. Why should they do that when it's their job to keep Qantas in line?
What do you think over the past, say, 5 years since COVID has been some of the outcomes that you might be able to say, well, is this potentially part of the influence that Qantas has over politicians in general, not being specific to anyone in particular?
I can point to a lot of things. And even further back, like, I would point out, this isn't an Anthony Albanese thing. It's not a Jason Clare thing. It's not a Scott Morrison thing. It's been happening for 30, 40 years, both sides of politics. Qantas has been very successful at blocking their competitors internationally from flying into Australia. They blocked Singapore from launching the Pacific route between Australia and America in 2007. The Howard government blocked that after very successful lobbying by Qantas. And then there was the Qatar decision by the Albanese government last year in 2023. But even before that, the Morrison government decided not to save Virgin Australia when COVID hit. That was a very interesting decision. And then, of course, later the Morrison government gave Qantas almost $3 billion of subsidies during COVID. At the same time, Qantas was illegally sacking 1,700 people, 1,700 baggage handlers, all while Qantas was taking JobKeeper. And there's just a general understanding by the public that as they came out of COVID, Qantas is printing these super profits when its customer service was absolutely in the toilet. You can't sort of deny that that was happening.
Finally, you've done a lot of robust reporting and commentary on Qantas, including but not limited to this book. Have they ever tried to offer you free membership?
No, they haven't. I mean, as I disclosed in my book quite right up front, I used to be a travel journalist. I worked at Qantas in the PR department, so I gave lots of free flights to journalists and upgrades. I then worked as a travel journalist and received many of the same benefits. And I went on trips with Alan Joyce. That's all on the public record. Later on, I stopped doing that and came to the conclusion that if I was going to be a serious business journalist, I had to leave that sort of stuff behind. But I've also have been, since 2018, been a member of Virgin's invite-only lounge, which is called Beyond. That's also disclosed in the book. But I would say if anyone has read any of my columns about Virgin Australia, I don't think they will be left in any doubt that it has not affected my independence. Some fairly savage columns on them. So I put my hand up to being part of the system that I'm now talking about. But unfortunately, I've never qualified for the Chairman's Lounge, and I suspect that is going to remain the case.
You and me both. Joe Aston, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
That was Joe Aston, columnist and author of The Chairman's Lounge, the inside story of how Qantas sold us out. Now here's my chat with Independent Senator David Pocock.
Hey, Bension. Thanks for having me.
Do you recall the first time that you were ever in the Qantas Chairman's Lounge and how that happened?
Roughly. I was given access when I was elected to the Senate, and it would have been travelling somewhere for a committee.
What was that experience like?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice in there. It's a private area in the airport. They've got snack area, drinks cabinets, an a la carte menu, quiet spaces to work, printers. Yeah, I think it's like a sort of business class lounge, but nicer.
Being an invitation-only space for politicians and other very powerful people, did you find that there were lobbyists in there or people who might want to bend the ear of someone like yourself?
I didn't. It was always quiet. I was often in there either working or doing an interview. I can see why politicians make the argument that they should have access to a space like that. But after a while, it really didn't sit right with me. It didn't seem to square with what I'm hearing from people in the ACT about how they want their elected representatives to be, I guess, conducting the behaviour. And also, to be honest, really concerned about the influence of Qantas on the government around the Qatar Airways decision. And I think a whole range of other things that Joe Aston has highlighted in his book.
You rescinded your membership last year. Just tell us why you made that decision.
I rescinded it because I didn't feel comfortable with it. As I said, I think you can have many reasons why politicians should have access to a space like that, but it just didn't really square with the way that I wanted to do things. And so I just decided, no, I don't want to be part of this. I think it is an important issue to be talking about, but I think this is just a symptom of a much bigger problem in politics when it comes to the lack of transparency, what politicians think are acceptable standards versus what the public, who we should be working for, think is acceptable.
Given that you were going into Parliament, you knew you would be making laws. Presumably you knew that aviation regulation might come up at some point in your term. Why did you accept it in the first place?
That's a good question. I think you can make the arguments that it is useful to be able to have a dedicated room where you can do a live media interview for TV or find a place to print some stuff before a hearing. And I think that was the way I thought about it. But as I said, particularly when the Qatar decision was made and I was part of helping get up the bilateral airlines inquiry up in the Senate, it just didn't sit well with me. And so I decided to not have that access.
Do you think that politicians should flat out be banned from accepting these kinds of memberships?
I certainly think we should be having that debate. But as I said, I'm concerned that all the focus is on this one issue. And then if we come to some sort of resolution on this, people think, oh, well, we've solved integrity issues. This is just a symptom of a much bigger problem where a transport minister can get tens of thousands of dollars of upgrades from an airline. And as long as they declare them, that's totally fine. That's clearly not up to scratch. So I think there's a whole heap of things that need to be done to actually improve transparency in this area.
Outside of transparency, because obviously a whole lot of politicians have declared that they are members of the Chairman's Lounge or that they've got free upgrades at various points, where is the line for you about what is potentially corrupting gifts and what is just some of the small perks of the job that you would expect politicians to get?
Well, I mean, not being a minister, I don't get a whole heap of gifts and perks thrown my way, to be honest. What I do get, I declare and put on my registry of interest. And, really the biggest ones are probably knowing a few people in bands, and when they're in Canberra, then getting in touch and saying, do you want to come have a listen? Yeah, outside of that, I'm not taking, I was offered tickets to World Cup, Matilda's World Cup games. I didn't think that was right, taking those tickets from a corporate. So, I think you make your own personal decisions. But again, we have a much bigger issue here around the lack of transparency around lobbying, and the same major parties that want to sling mud around when it comes to flight upgrades are not willing to deal with the root causes of this, is that a system where you can just declare things and everything's fine.
David Pocock, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Benson. Cheers.
Independent Senator David Pocock there, and before him, columnist and author Joe Aston. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go though, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might be keen to hear it. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another ep this afternoon from 3. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.